Lara Croft, video game icon and 3D sex symbol. Brave, inquisitive, and as explained by her creator, Toby Gard, like all characters of gaming at the time, she was cartoonishly proportioned.
It was deliberately like taking cues from comic book characters, so they are kind of exaggerated.
The 90s was memorable for many things, one of which was the sensational rise of girl power. Google 90s icons and the top results will be Jennifer Aniston, the Spice Girls, Gwen Stefani, J-Lo, Clueless, it goes on and on. So Lara couldn't have been born at a better time. But she's hung around thanks to the ingenuity of game developers Core for 7 years and then Crystal Dynamics for the next 20, as well as their parent publishers, starting with Eidos, then Square Enix, and now, finally, Sweden's The Embracer Group. Since making the purchase, the Embracer Group have claimed that there is a new Tomb Raider game in the pipeline. So with that in mind, here is a full history of all the Tomb Raider games, which include the developer stories that led to the rise, fall, and re-rise of the Tomb Raider, starting with her origins in 1996. Tomb Raider, 1996. This was the year that publisher Eidos Interactive purchased the development studio Core Design. And with it came a team of 6 devs who for the past 3 years had been working on a 3D adventure game, which they hoped would be revolutionary. Inspired by Indiana Jones, the protagonist sported a whip which he could use to fight enemies and navigate difficult terrain. And apparently he also sported a moustache. Nevertheless, Eidos knew only too well how protective George Lucas is of his property, and so they convinced the team lead animator Toby Gard to rework the main character. The result was actually Lara Cruz, who after some oversight from management, then was further anglified into Lara Croft, whose pixelated figure and bold demeanour would soon propel her to stardom onto the front of over 1,200 publications, from PC Gamer through to Forbes and Time magazine, a number so high it actually put her in the Guinness Book of Records, where she resides to this day. But before there was Lara Croft, there was Tomb Raider. The game needed to play well, and navigating the world had proven to be the biggest challenge, until the team settled on a system of square tiles that divided the entire world into a giant grid, a method still used now to great effect. Thanks to methods like tessellation, when these tiles were combined on the walls and floor, they tricked the eye into seeing fully textured surfaces, which allowed the team to construct large levels otherwise beyond their means. As all the accessible parts of the world were effectively made of large cubes, Lara was then coded to move naturally within these square shapes, so a standing jump allowed her to climb up one tile, a standing leap would cross 2 tiles, and by running the length of a single tile, she could then long jump up to 3 tiles. This simple mechanic had a tremendous application to the game, as it allowed gamers to figure out distances on the fly and to navigate the world with relative ease, despite the moveset which we generally refer to as tank controls having been born out of hardware restraints. Tank controls would still be in use a decade later, but despite being such an early subscriber, Tomb Raider leveraged the system better than anything that came after it. The simple moveset that included flips and rolls could be used to both navigate puzzles and dodge enemies without breaking stride. By drawing your weapons, the button used to interact with terrain then changed to shoot, so platforming was impossible while fighting, but the remainder of the controls remained the same, and so transitioning between different segments always felt fluid. The story didn't do much to distance itself from other titles at the time, but the nature of the lonely environments and sprawling temples did more to paint a picture of Lara's world than any narrative might have. The puzzles were challenging and made full use of the sprawling maze-like level design, and when combined with Graham Revell's mysterious and atmospheric soundtrack, this problem-solving platformer quickly propelled to the top of gaming charts at the time. None of the other titles released the same year had made any great strides in revolutionizing their controls, and so despite feeling a little stiff, the streamlined moveset did make Lara one of the most satisfying characters to control during that era, and naturally the public wanted more. Tomb Raider 2, 1997. Eidos was seeing the money roll in and they wanted more too, pushing Core to turn out an entire sequel within the next year. And so was born a somewhat divisive game that really seemed to polarize its fans and critics. Much of the drama probably going over the heads of casual or younger gamers like myself at the time. 1997's outing featured a larger variety of memorable locations and an absolute tidal wave of human enemies too. To combat this larger threat, Lara now had more powerful weapons like an M16 and a grenade launcher, This greatly shifted the focus to that of an action game. Eidos wanted an action hero, and that was what Lara was set to become. As these combat sequences served to be the game's main challenge, the maze-like puzzles of the previous entry took a back seat. Toby Gard had grown frustrated over how Eidos transformed Lara in the public eye from the strong female lead he'd envisioned to a sexually exploited asset. He clashed repeatedly with their marketing team and went on record as saying that they tried to convince him to implement a nude code, which he refused. Side note, with the combined resources of a million horny teenagers, that was an avalanche that even Lara couldn't have dodged. But at least it wasn't on Toby's watch. By now, Eidos were relying on the fact that her sex appeal was completely entangled with her character, and so they were continuing to market a far more adult and combat-heavy experience, and so there was little that Gard could do except for walk away, which he did. Without his influence, Eidos were free to do as they pleased, and it showed. Graphically, a number of clear improvements were made. The introduction of a skybox replaced the overused fog of war seen in Tomb Raider 1, which at the time had impacted the immersion on daytime levels like the Lost Valley with its pitch black sky. Lara's trademark manor house that could be toured at your leisure was greatly expanded, and I remember losing hours exploring this place in that wonderful pre-internet age where you couldn't just go online and find solutions. You just had to hunt around until you were satisfied, and having a non-linear level that you could access from the menu simply for the purpose of exploring and testing out moves and having fun was so ahead of its time. And, of course, Lara's character model was updated as well. Her ponytail would now swing as she moved, and her outfits would change depending on the level. These changes did serve to further humanize Lara, as you could see her making practical choices based on where she was going or what she was doing. The controls were pretty much untouched, making it a smooth transition for returning players, although she can now scale ladders and flip 180 in the air. Many retrospective reviews of Tomb Raider 2 like to hammer home the point that this game lost much of its original charm by swapping out tombs for modern levels and increasing the number of human enemies from just 5 in the original to hundreds. And you know what? I agree. Fuck that. This game was amazing. Variety is the spice of life, and Lara is not a one-trick pony. The platforming and puzzle elements that relied on the grid-like world and hidden switches were absolutely still there. The environments were actually very similar, they simply got a reskin to now appear as the modern world, as was the luxury of building everything out of giant cubes. Lara needed to differentiate herself from Indiana Jones's legacy, and it was this game where we saw her as a globe-trotting urban warrior that it really started. It was easier too, and in contrast to the long, isolated and sometimes onerous segments of the original, instead it was saturated in memorable locations with way more variety to the world, from the temples and the monasteries and the Great Wall of China, to maritime rigs and sunken ships and all the industrial jungles in between. She could climb on and off a snowmobile while exploring the Tibetan foothills. She could navigate the Venetian canals in one of their iconic motorboats. And the epilogue, in what I would consider one of the most memorable levels in Tomb Raider history, has some goons attack Lara in her home in the Surrey foothills in a last-ditch effort to recover the stolen prize. Clothed in a silk gown and weaponless, you have to sprint for your shotgun locked in the safe and proceed to defend your home. It was invigorating and atmospheric, and most importantly was a cinematic conclusion to the story, like it was lifted from the pages of a Tom Clancy novel. Despite the critical success though, sales didn't quite live up to the original, due in part to the change in tone, and so Eidos yet again urged Core to put their heads down and churn out another annual release. Tomb Raider 3, 1998. At this point, the team at Core pushed back. It almost burnt themselves out from the long hours required to make the previous game and wanted a minimum of 2 years to create something truly next-gen, which ideally would be released with Sony's next PlayStation model. And so Eidos decided to split the risk, allowing the original team to work on the next big thing, while a new team was assembled to construct Tomb Raider 3. The tiled movement system remained unchanged, making it feel like a very linear sequel, and so instead improvements to the game would be found through yet more weapons, outfits and vehicles, as well as improved lighting effects, enemy variety, and most importantly, locations visited. This was a personal favourite of mine from the Core era, still a pretty tight clone of the original, yet by this point it boasted significantly better graphics and a more cinematic experience all round. There was some backlash over the fact that Lara doesn't infiltrate any proper tombs beyond the temples in the early segment of the game, and while I do empathise for those who strongly prefer the isolated crypts and quiet puzzle-solving elements of the series, the supernatural tone of the game has Lara chase down a great many variety of mystical treasures from all over the world, and many of these simply won't be found in tombs, and that's just the reality of the world that they've built around the character. A new mechanic was introduced to the level structure that, despite being a gimmick, did actually add some fresh immersion. The first and final levels were fixed, but the order that you took on the middle 3 locations were up to you, consisting of tropical islands in the South Pacific, Gothic London, and a stretch of Nevada where you'd eventually infiltrate Area 51. The level order actually has less impact than players realised at the time, beyond your basic ammo count for the final stretch, but the additional control over Lara felt like a significant new dynamic. With highly challenging levels like the lost city of Tinos at the end of the game, or finding Randy and Rory violently sacrificed in the opening hours, it's clear that while focus on action remained the same, the adult tones were being dialed up. And also we got the best rendition of Lara's mansion yet, with the addition of a sprint button which was used to access this really cool new trophy room that held artifacts brought back from the previous adventures. And 2, a shooting range that would trigger Winston to turn up in a hilarious outfit complete with a bulletproof dinner tray. And if you needed any proof that Eidos's marketing team were indeed capitalising on Lara's sex appeal, her poses during the ending credits told you everything you needed to know. Being a publicly traded company, Eidos answered to shareholders. At this stage, due entirely to Tomb Raider's massive success, in just 3 years, Eidos had just been named the fastest growing company in the world at the 1998 World Economic Forum. This cannot be overlooked in a story about rush production, but in short, it was poor management at core and short-sightedness on the part of Eidos which started to fracture their relationship. Bored of the crunch that they were constantly expected to maintain, the Tomb Raider developers at core secretly decided to put their all into a final game and kill Lara off at the end without telling their paymasters at Eidos, who despite everything did actually own core and indeed Tomb Raider. Of course, Eidos hadn't let them hold out for the release of the PS2, and so still running on the same hardware and running short of ideas, they had the radical idea of listening to critic and fan feedback. And with that, they chose to put the tomb back in Tomb Raider. Furthermore, writer Andy Sandom hit gold by introducing the first really memorable character other than Lara, and Winston the butler obviously, with Werner von Croy, Lara's mentor. The game starts with the player controlling a young Lara as Von Croy guides her through a tutorial level, and we witness some endearing coming-of-age segments, such as when she obtains her favoured backpack from an impaled corpse.
Ah, a backpack.
Kind of fitting for a Tomb Raider, I suppose. Before long you witness his greed overcome caution and he succumbs to a classic tomb trap, with young Lara failing to save him, setting him up to become the game and indeed Lara's long-term antagonist. Back in the current day, he returns the favour, which leads to Lara having to escape, and she inadvertently unleashes the Egyptian god Seth in the process. This then takes her on a journey across Egypt as she attempts to seal Seth back in his tomb and avoid Von Croy's thugs along the way. Lara's trademark blocky assets were further refined with the most sculpted rear end that they'd managed yet, and the simple introduction of cleavage to her character model raising more than just eyebrows amongst her teenage fans. Taking place entirely in Egypt, the levels moved between the titular tombs and all the innovative puzzles that came with them, as well as the cities of Karnak, Alexandria and Cairo. The problem was, despite both the textures and environmental objects being richer and more varied than ever before, everything and everywhere was shaded in the same sandy brick colour palette. It didn't matter that you were visiting different cities or different tombs. If you took a screenshot and asked somebody to tell you which level they were looking at, they'd struggle. And while countless vehicles were introduced, such as the bike and jeep, we also got new age puzzles that had us swinging awkwardly on ropes, traversing rotating rooms, or the most frustrating of all, having to extract items using other items and then combine these into new items to make another item, to find the place to use the item that gets another item. Oh my god, which just ended up being the most utterly unintuitive obstacles of the entire series. That's not to say that standout levels couldn't be found, such as a cargo train with its wobbling interior that would be replaced by a passing landscape as you climbed out onto the trundling platform, doused the level in an extra layer of immersion. Gunfights on top of a moving train is the sort of thing we might expect from Lara Croft, yet this is actually the only time we ever saw it, and indeed it came a full decade before her spiritual successor Nathan Drake found himself hanging from the rigging of a cargo plane. Despite all of the technical achievements and improved story, the game's rushed design was more evident than ever, and critics were quick to reflect on this in their reviews. Lara's fate at the end of the game was the extra cherry on the cake because Eidos somehow had no idea that the game hit the shelves with this ending in place, and of course had absolutely no intention of letting their most valuable asset stay dead, further souring the relationship between the developer and publisher, and, to a lesser extent, the public. Tomb Raider Chronicles 2000. If it wasn't apparent enough that the team at Core Design had lost their passion for Lara Croft, then Chronicles was really where it got hammered home. Eidos put pressure on the team to continue milking their cash cow, and designer Andy Sandham reflected that at this point, they were simply making a game to earn a paycheck. Despite killing her off, albeit off screen, the team came up with a fairly novel way of squeezing out one more game while Eidos considered the next move. And so it starts with Lara's funeral, which is attended by her loyal butler Winston and other friends. They then reminisce about her past adventures where they swap stories and we play out these adventures real time. Conceptually, this could actually have been pretty cool, but as a player it was hard to not draw parallels with the funeral party, whose full smiles couldn't hide the bittersweet reality that this was supposed to be a great final goodbye to Lara Croft. The first story has her travel to Rome in search of the Philosopher's Stone, with Italian architecture and courtyard gunfights immediately bringing the Venetian levels of Tomb Raider 2 to mind. Next we're on a Russian submarine, searching for the Spear of Destiny, with the metal walkways, military attire and stealth elements clearly being inspired by Tomb Raider 3. After that we control a teenage Lara a la Tomb Raider 4, this time she sneaks onto a boat heading to Ireland's Black Isle, a rock in the ocean occupied by supernatural forces. Lara is mostly defenseless in this level, and along with the gothic architecture and the horror elements, we see a new darker tone introduced in this segment of the game, which was a welcome departure from the usual style of the game in which you shoot first and ask questions later, which was awesome because it was the first time in a while we were actually seeing fresh innovation with a clear shift in tone.
It is easier to be brave from a distance.
But ultimately it was too little, too late. Finally, she dons her sexiest outfit yet as she infiltrates Von Croy's corporate hideout in search of the Iris. Clearly influenced by the ever-popular Metal Gear Solid that had been released just 2 years earlier, and designed to confer a trendy 90s Mission Impossible vibe, it failed to live up to either, and worse yet, the confined space and stealth elements really highlighted the now dated movement controls as having even less utility. The narrative that split the game into 4 different styles of levels really just made it feel like a compilation of tributes to better games, which is actually what it was. And after these 4 segments are complete, the final cutscene has Von Croy finding Lara's backpack, confirming that really the entire game was just a stopgap before Eidos could get their money-making team back in line. Just a few months later, lessons still unlearned, Eidos were keen for the latest game release to be accelerated so as to ride the success of 2001's Lara Croft Tomb Raider: The Cradle of Life. Tomb Raider: The Angel of Darkness, 2003. It would still be another 2 years until we would see that release, and all the delays in the world couldn't have saved Core when, in 2003, they rushed the still unfinished Angel of Darkness onto store shelves. The title was so disastrous and widely panned that it almost killed the entire franchise and resulted in Eidos stripping Core of the Tomb Raider rights forever.
Why should I care?
Gavin Romery of the original 6-person Tomb Raider team said in an interview with Ars Technica that it felt like robbery as Eidos took the game and ran. But he also said, when talking about the 40 members of the Angel of Darkness team, there were lots of people with headphones on, just all working on their bit, and then one disaster after another as they realised things didn't tally up. And so the cowboy outfit that once celebrated its ability to exist without a management structure because it was so small had grown too fast and now lacked the oversight required to helm so much resource. The beginning of the end actually started back while Chronicles, the previous game, was still in development, when a separate dedicated team at Core got hold of the PS2 development kit and started to lay the groundwork for something truly next-gen, or that was what they intended. 1 year later, when Chronicles was completed and those developers turned their attention to this new project in the hopes of hitting the ground running, what they were presented with was said to have been disastrous. And that's by the standards of the people who just created Chronicles. I might well be in the minority for my love of the second and third titles with their gunfights and modern environments, but try as I might, and I really did try, even I struggled to find love for this one. I loved the concept. The shift in tone could have worked as another non-tomb raiding adventure. Instead, it was just a hodgepodge of failed design. The story had Lara meeting up with Von Croy after he reaches out for help, before being framed for his death, thus embarking on an urban murder mystery as she hunts for the obscure paintings through the streets of Paris and Prague, before uncovering sinister experiments gone wrong in labs beneath the city streets. By this stage, titanic titles like Splinter Cell and Metal Gear Solid 2 had been out for a couple of years and were hugely popular. If Mission Impossible had influenced the developers at core, should it be a surprise that AAA gaming titles would do the same? Well, they did. And it was painfully clear for all to see, with even Resident Evil shaping the finale. Even including an unlikely love interest who we play as because, well, Angelina Jolie had 2 boyfriends in the movies. Where Chronicles was a failed tribute to earlier Tomb Raider games, Angel of Darkness was just a tribute to everything. The departure for jungle tombs and the subsequent mashup of elements like stealth and hand-to-hand combat and a gritty film noir mystery did nothing to enhance the Tomb Raider experience. And in practical terms, the game was just impossible to enjoy, with the tile system and iconic controls finally having been ditched for more natural movement that ended up being anything but. The unwanted stealth mechanics were head-shakingly poor. The free-spirited camera deserves its own video, cutscenes you can't skip, horrendous movement controls, momentum-ruining bugs, no autosave, an unfinished storyline, broken mechanics, and these were just a short list of its problems, and I'm not kidding. Just to give you one quick example of the mechanics that were indicative of a larger broken game, let's take a quick look at the movement. Unlike PlayStation 1, all PS2 controllers featured analog sticks on release, and this could allow players on select games to control walking speed through tilting, which of course is standard stuff now. Despite this, Angel of Darkness still included the dedicated walk and sneak shoulder buttons from earlier entries. It's outdated but fine, it's in line with the original controls, so let's go and move on. The thing is, ever since Tomb Raider 1, walking ensured that Lara wouldn't fall over the edge. It was a fundamental aspect for her moveset that allows you to walk to the edge and then hop back for a run-up. Everybody knows this, except somebody decided to program the analog stick in anyway, so tilting would indeed make her walk. Great. Except it didn't stop her from falling over the edge. So if you chose to use the stick to walk, it actually wouldn't serve its only function. In fact, it was a honey trap because using it would invariably kill you. And this, of course, was the days before patching, so these staggering oversights remained unchanged to this day, and 20 years on, its disdain amongst the gaming community is still palpable. Tomb Raider Legend, 2006. And so it was that Eidos decided to move their chips over to one of its more reliable American studios, Crystal Dynamics, whose stricter corporate structure meant that they famously never missed a deadline. And their first step was to convince none other than Lara's creator Toby Gard to return and breathe life back into his iconic character. And he did exactly that, assisting in her visual redesign, co-writing the story and implementing new aspects to her movement system. And while I've never seen it discussed online, I'd like to point out that this included reintroducing a grapple hook, which of course he was personally forced to give up when he scrapped his Indiana Jones clone 10 years earlier. Returning Lara to her roots, the game was everything that Angel of Darkness should have been. Along with a far more cinematic narrative, the graphics were actually next-gen, with richer and more believable environments than ever before. The control scheme was stripped down and rebuilt with competent 8-axis movement that allowed her to jump in any direction without needing a run-up, nor needing to hold action in order to grab ledges. It wasn't perfect, but navigating the terrain was just so much more fluid than past entries, and when combined with new melee strikes, on-screen targeting and slow-mo shooting, the entire experience just felt like a breath of fresh air. The 3-year turnaround when compared to Core's traditional annual releases really showed. The HUD and general overlays haven't dated so well, with the icons of your loadout sort of bringing to mind that straight-to-DVD box art of the era.
Coming soon to own on video and DVD.
And indeed, another design choice of the time which wasn't cool until Halo did it was restricting you to a pair of weapon sets, one of which was always the trusty infinite ammo pistols, and the other being a single weapon scavenged from enemies. Along with the introduction of grenades, the new combat system was far more arcadey, but ultimately more entertaining than the previous entries, and if you failed an action sequence, you could easily mix up the experience by getting your hands on a different enemy weapon for the next attempt. It was also a lot easier than previous entries, and the cartoony graphics provided a more kid-friendly experience, with enemy kills feeling less gritty and more like playing whack-a-mole, which some argued was also visible in the linear level designs and simple puzzles. Now, don't get me wrong, the physics-based problem-solving elements were usually pretty fun, but the game rating was PEGI 12 for a reason. The delivery of the story was still level-based, but flowed far more like a feature-length film, although the narrative still took as many liberties as it ever did, like seeing Lara wander the rain-swept inner streets of Cornwall in England with an M16 on her back. Other times it might be charming moments, like when Lara kicks her high heels off before engaging thugs barefoot in a cocktail dress, or another where she patiently lets Russian guards debate about whether to give her a code, and then after they relent, she thanks them in their native tongue.
Spasiba. Pожелайте мне удачи.
These are the moments that remind you why she's an appealing character, and they're great when they come up. Of course, quick-time events were also abundant, at one point being stretched across an entire level in the form of an unoriginal bike chase sequence, and constant camera pans all served to disrupt the momentum rather than enhance it, but these were just textbook examples of the time period that it was released. Another is the obligatory support team that was all the rage, made up of Zip the techie, Alistair the historian, and of course Winston, who served to either progress the story or comment on your actions for a touch of comedy relief. This was actually a stark contrast to the lonely, isolated feeling of the original games that promoted Lara as a gutsy, independent operator.
And I doubt any of that snow and ice is stable.
And hardcore fans continued to voice their concerns. The overall experience felt more like a Hollywood movie based on the original games rather than a standalone reboot, and so it's no coincidence that it shared a number of similarities with the films. Story-wise, it was effectively a reboot, with scattered sword fragments and a hunt for King Arthur taking you to Ghana, Peru, Tokyo, England and Kazakhstan, all tied together by Lara's quest to find her mother, who she witnessed fall through a supernatural portal when she was a child. Unfortunately, it was to be the first of a 3-story arc, and as such, it ended on a cliffhanger. And before we might get to the conclusion, Core would try for one final push. Tomb Raider Anniversary, 2007. At this point, Core Design had been sidelined to work on some pretty forgettable projects, but they took note of Capcom's success with the 2002 remake of Resident Evil, and so studio manager Gavin Rummery pitched an anniversary remake concept to Eidos and their new parent company, SCI Games. The pitch was a success, and so it was that a team of Tomb Raider veterans at Core set around remaking the original game in a new engine. However, politics came into play, and when Crystal Dynamics found out, they convinced management to keep all Tomb Raider production in one place, effectively pulling the rug out from under Core Design and starting development on their own version using their new Legend engine. Core's version was famously leaked and is still playable, and actually did look pretty damn good. It's a little bit fiddly to set up, but I have popped a link in the description if you're minded to have a go. That was to be the beginning of the end for Core, as Crystal Dynamics were about to score yet another win with what some more hardcore fans consider as the best Tomb Raider game to date.
Now what's a man gotta do to get that sort of attention from you?
Tomb Raider Anniversary was a reimagining of the original game, which is still considered the holy grail of Tomb Raider experiences. It followed the same quest and took cues from the original environments, but at the same time cashing in on their new game engine that allowed for exciting new levels and types of puzzles. Crystal Dynamics now had an origin tale on their hands, sandwiched between Legend and their planned follow-up. As a result, they worked it into the larger 3-game story arc, nicely setting up Tomb Raider 1 antagonist Natla as Lara's main enemy across the new series. With all the controls and acrobatic movements introduced in Legend, traversing the world is just as fluid and exciting, but unlike Legend, the entire experience returned Lara to her foundations, with all but a couple of the levels taking place in ancient ruins and tombs. Furthermore, a clear effort was made to show Lara going to extreme lengths to avoid killing humans.
And we both know you're not gonna kill me for it.
And the impact it had on her when she did. The isolation of empty, long-forgotten tombs is perpetuated by ominous ambient sounds, which works nicely with the hugely toned-down backing track in order to keep with the original, only really ramping up for dedicated battles. Other nice touches included the long-lost sound effect for finding secret items, which was a nice nod to the original. It was a strangely cathartic experience to once again enjoy the peacefulness that came from problem-solving your way through tombs without a thumping orchestral score or rocket launchers and assault rifles hanging off your back. Of course, this also means we spend a lot more time engaging in the morally dubious act of wiping endangered species from the face of the earth, but you really can't have it all. Graphically, the PlayStation version struck me as being a little underwhelming when compared to comparative titles, with the PC version being a better reflection of its potential with enhanced water effects and better ambient lighting. The ubiquitous QuickTime animations haven't aged well either, no surprise there, which had by this point seeped into the game during combat, allowing for quick dodge insta-kills, but overall it was a competent reimagining of Lara's most treasured adventure. Because it wasn't a standalone reboot, but instead integrated into this new 3-story arc, it didn't inspire any further remakes, and that was a shame. But despite boasting a sort of cult status among fans who prioritised tomb raiding above all else, the reality was it hugely undersold at around 1.5 million copies compared to Legend that was over 3. Its title can't have helped, making it sound more like a reskinned copy of the original rather than the excellent prequel reboot that it was. Tomb Raider Underworld, 2008. For this reason, it shouldn't have been a surprise that when the third and final entry to the series came out, it returns to the arcadey and action-focused roots set down by Legend. And it also sold between 3 and 4 million copies, which finally helped cement the truth. Most of the paying public likes action. Starting shortly after the conclusion of Legend, Lara's continued quest to find her mother takes her from the Med to Thailand to Mexico to the Arctic and more, as she pursues the fabled underworld depicted in Norse mythology. Being the finale, it pulls in all the allies and enemies from the previous 2 entries, as well as upping the scale of the set pieces to combine both jungle ruins of old to exciting and immersive environments that only the newer engine was capable of rendering. One of these included the underbelly of Lara's home, as well as a segment where it gets attacked and turned into a blazing inferno, in a nod of sorts to Tomb Raider 2. It isn't all roses though, and the closer to the conclusion you get, the more linear and uninspired the design gets. The writing was also somewhat template driven, and the lackluster conclusion could be seen coming from a mile away. Some of the new features were hard to miss, such as a dual lock-on with the pistols, or scuba diving sections that, while not as intense as the frantic hold-your-breath moments of Tomb Raider 2, did provide some variety to break up the platforming and combat segments. And dead enemies and environmental destruction would now remain in place. For all the ups and the downs, it did do more right than it did wrong, and was an enjoyable experience because of it, but ultimately Lara was supposed to be a superstar, with Tomb Raider titles dominating the charts on release. Yet, on Metacritic, it received a score of 80, and so in 2008, that meant it was outranked by Dead Space, Left 4 Dead, Fallout 3, Grand Theft Auto 4, Metal Gear Solid 4, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Fable 2, Far Cry 2, Gears of War 2, Mirror's Edge, Burnout Paradise, and a bunch more. As popular as it was a long way from winning any Game of the Year awards. Nevertheless, it served to keep Lara Croft afloat at a very delicate time, because just 1 year earlier, Nathan Drake had arrived on the scene, and just 1 year after the release of Underworld, he would return in the critically acclaimed Uncharted 2, putting some serious competition on the chopping block, which would serve to light a mighty fire under Crystal Dynamics. Lara Croft and the Guardian of Light, 2010. Shortly after the release of Underworld, Eidos came under the control of Square Enix of Final Fantasy fame, who split Crystal Dynamics in half. One team was tasked with the longer-term goal of re-engineering Tomb Raider into something that could compete with Uncharted, now Game of the Year, and the other half with building something of a more arcadey nature that could be turned out in a shorter time frame and cash in on the name and buy the other team some time. The list of requirements was actually not short. It needed to be graphically simple so that it could run on mobile platforms as well as consoles. It needed to be a fun single-player adventure but also support couch co-op to maximise the player base. It needed to be filled with interactive puzzles that would promote Lara as the queen of problem-solving adventures as well as feature exciting gunplay. It needed to be popular enough to keep her financially viable while the other team worked on the next big thing. And in all of this, it actually succeeded. Despite being scaled down, the animations and movements were lifted from the full-sized games, and for once Lara herself couldn't be relied on to distract players, which left the developers with no choice, God forbid, but to focus on fun and engaging gameplay, and so that's what they did. The game used dual sticks to move and shoot, and in spite of the non-stop barrage of enemies, the majority of progression would actually be hindered by the numerous environmental puzzles, which made clever use of your surroundings and physics mechanics. The story was basically non-existent, but that aside, it proved an entertaining and refined experience beginning to end. It performed reasonably well, a shade better than Underworld in fact, which was ideal due to its lower production costs. Tomb Raider, 2013.
This explorer once said that the extraordinary is in what we do, not who we are.
And then, in late 2012, seemingly out of nowhere, the internet blew up with a teaser trailer from an up-and-coming Tomb Raider release, featuring a far more realistic Lara, in a modern pair of Beats earbuds no less, before a thrilling sequence had her almost drown in a storm and wash up on a graveyard of rotting ships. This foreshadowed the release of 2013's Tomb Raider Reboot, and what a reboot it was. It served as an origin story, and within the realm of fantasy adventures, it was the most believable yet. On an expedition to find the lost city of Yamatai, Lara is shipwrecked on an island somewhere off the coast of Japan, in a stretch of sea that bears fictional resemblance to the Bermuda Triangle. However, the island's controlled by a violent cult made up of hapless survivors, trapped seemingly forever due to the storms continuing to destroy any ships that come or go. New inhabitants that washed up on the shore would either be slaughtered like animals or forced to join the ranks and take on the same unspeakable tasks that would then of course drive them mad. Well, of course, Lara has different ideas.
It was gonna hurt.
Choosing instead to penetrate the island and unravel its mythical secrets in order to release the place and the people from its curse. If you can get on board with an ancient weather spell sinking ships, then everything else falls into place naturally, because the vast majority of the time you'll be fighting people who are ravaged by time and have succumbed to desperation. Your enemies are far more human, both graphically and metaphorically, and as a result, some of the kills you're forced to make are morally dubious.
Go to hell.
But to counter this, Lara's actions are essentially justified under the threat of murder and even rape. This is really more of a horror survival action game. Lara is vulnerable enough to make for a far more mature and emotive story. She takes a serious battering as the journey unfolds. There's just a far more immersive and memorable experience than anything we'd ever seen before. As such, you can absolutely believe that this is the place where the Tomb Raider could have been born.
My God, what's driven them to this?
You witness her mental fortitude firsthand as she refuses to succumb to supernatural horrors or material greed, just like her one and only true mentor.
That belongs in a museum!
Both the previously established timeline and the arcadey feel that went with it were completely gone, and the intensity was dialed up to 11. Again, Toby Gard returned to help write the script, and finally, we got to see the strong female lead he'd been pushing for almost 2 decades earlier. A really good performance by Camilla Luddington, establishing Lara as just far more exposed and human, which is doubled down by her figure being more realistic and less exploited than in times past. She's dressed more realistically, and as the game progresses, she gradually gets more and more battered and bruised, and by the end of the game, there's an almost visceral appreciation for the fact that Lara should barely be able to stand. It was the first time I ever felt sorry for Lara. And that was only possible due to the excellent character design. Lara now has 4 types of weapons that she'll be carrying around before the conclusion, conveniently mapped to the D-pad, each serving a distinctly different purpose and occasionally upgrading to a more powerful variant as the story progresses. Despite acquiring a pistol, the stealthy and very satisfying to use bow and arrow were established as the new weapon of choice, as per all the artwork. Nevertheless, in the closing moments of the game, we're treated to an awesome sequence in which she grabs a second pistol and unloads lead in one of the best pieces of fan service I ever remember seeing in a game. The controls received another overhaul to become the most streamlined yet, with improved stealth and the introduction of decent cover mechanics. There are also new tools such as the ice axe, a gnarly looking club that she uses to scale walls and clobber her enemies, as well as the attachments to the bow that would open up new ways to traverse the world. And then these could all be upgraded at campfires alongside the weapons, providing a juicy extra layer of gameplay to an already satisfying experience. But the real show stealer was the incredibly organic and seamless looking environment, which used visual cues like splashes of paint to indicate where Lara could jump and climb. No longer split into traditional levels, the open world featured more memorable segments than you could count. Of course, the narrative would dictate a somewhat linear path, but it was masked by mesmerising environments and the ingenious use of hidden tombs throughout the island that prompted you to stray off the path wherever possible, all encouraging the illusion of free reign. Each tomb would include some sort of interactive puzzle-solving element, and at the end you'd be rewarded with an upgrade, and the optional aspect did make it feel more like raiding a tomb, not because you needed to, but because you wanted to. The thrilling animated events were, of course, an unabashed answer to Uncharted's action set pieces, but Nathan Drake arrived second and definitely started that fight, so critics agreed it was clear that both franchises were simply keeping one another on their toes. With the introduction of fluid platforming, balanced combat, relentlessly exciting action sequences, a very well constructed cinematic narrative, and an inspired story for the birth of the Tomb Raider, Lara was back on top. Almost. In truth, Square Enix actually lost money due to the exceptionally high production costs and high, but not high enough critical acclaim that they claimed affected sales. And then, within months of its release, Naughty Dog, developers of Uncharted, pulled out a nuclear trump card with The Last of Us that would raise the bar on excellence even higher.
Run, you bastards! I'm coming for you all!
She killed Nikolai! Where did she get the thing?
Lara Croft and the Temple of Osiris, 2014. A year later, Crystal Dynamics slipped out a sequel to their isometric shooter by the way of Temple of Osiris. Much the same as Guardian of Light, it allowed for single or co-op gameplay, but this time around more emphasis was placed on playing it with a friend, the puzzles and difficulty being toned down if playing it alone due to the nature of some of the It Takes Two puzzle designs.
There has got to be a way up.
It was still fun, but despite everything it just wasn't as good as its predecessor, which was reflected in its mediocre reviews. Nevertheless, with the new series in full swing, most Lara Croft fans were still too busy playing the Tomb Raider reboot to notice. Rise of the Tomb Raider, 2015. 2 years after the reboot hit the shelves, at the beginning of 2015, Rise of the Tomb Raider was released. But, to the dismay of many fans worldwide, Microsoft bagged the exclusive rights, turning away PlayStation fans from Tomb Raider for the first time in 20 years. It is worth noting though that Square Enix may have been forced to take Microsoft up on a lucrative deal due to the losses of the previous game. Nevertheless, By the end of the year, it did make its way to PlayStation and then PC, but not before slightly souring its reputation. The new entry was a true successor, with the same reliance on a strong, character-driven narrative interspersed through incredibly impressive environments and lofty set pieces. Although QuickTime events do still exist in some form or other, navigating these segments was usually as thrilling as ever, more so in fact due to the addition of impressive new visual effects and outstanding ambient sound.
I'm here!
I'll climb down there and get you!
All of which really supercharged the immersion. While the terrain type is considerably more varied than the humid forests of the previous game, there's now a heavy reliance on snow-capped mountains and icy wastelands, although that's okay because these are presented so effectively that sometimes you get the chills just watching Lara shiver. A number of elements were of course introduced, such as swappable outfits that provided minor benefits, a swimming of sorts that allowed for yet more methods of dodging or stealth killing enemies, and the ability to leap over tree branches for pretty much the same effect. Story-wise, Lara is still hung up on what she considers her father's murder, and so embarks on a quest that takes her to the icy wastelands and Russian gulags to uncover a prophet who bears more than a passing resemblance to Jesus. The enemies are no longer frenzied islanders, but instead a more insidious mercenary outfit called Trinity, who are better trained and better equipped to counter Lara's outrageous onslaughts. The thing is, these new action-heavy enemies were to be the first red flag that the producers were getting cold feet about the horror elements of the game, perhaps worried that the excessively violent themes of the first had played its part in the underwhelming performance. The simplistic 4-weapon mechanic was scaled up too, with considerably more emphasis put on your arsenal of weapons and attachments. And this was the second flag. It actually took away more than it added because the bow, pistol, shotgun and machine gun of the original had very opposing functions and each served to combat different scenarios effectively. The overkill nature of multiple machine guns and shotguns diluted the significance of each weapon type, making the genre stray back toward the combat-heavy action that the reboot had distanced itself from. This was doubled down by the variety of handmade explosives and various weapon attachments, which meant you could no longer conveniently quick swap to a given weapon using the D-pad, but instead had to mess around with having to cycle attachments in the heat of battle. I had also desperately hoped that after the finale of the previous game we'd get to see Lara sporting 2 pistols, or maybe gain a second one as a later game upgrade, but no such luck. Instead we see the return of the silencer, which is so absurdly effective at making ranged stealth kills that it effectively nerfs the bow into the ground, rendering it almost obsolete in the final chapters of the game. At the end of the day, side by side, Rise just didn't live up to its 2013 predecessor because it didn't improve on the original's few shortcomings, but rather tried to scale up what they knew worked. Where the original had rich environments, awe-inspiring set pieces and engaging combat, Rise matched this and even improved on it, doing an especially impressive job when trekking through snowdrifts. But to justify the price tag, they attempted to innovate by adding complexity, and that only served to spoil the momentum and make it more finicky to play. Unsurprisingly, this was picked up on by fans and critics alike, but nevertheless kept people happy until the finale was to appear 3 years later. Shadow of the Tomb Raider 2018. In 2018, Shadow of the Tomb Raider arrived. This time round, we experience a Lara who is far more fleshed out than ever before, and the vulnerability that we saw in the first game where she took on challenges that were forced upon her is starting to be replaced by the intensity of an obsessed treasure hunter, which is addressed through thought-provoking arguments with Jonah.
You can't protect everyone.
Despite all the choice on the market these days, decent AAA games that feature true puzzle-solving ingenuity are just a rare gem. And that is why it was such a pleasure to find that various hidden crypts and massive challenge tombs in this final entry were complex, always unique, and most importantly engaging experiences which serve to scratch that itch so often missing in Tomb Raider games. This time round, the game also steps up the level design by not just filling it with environmental variety, but also locals, which may have been a little bit late to the game, but it finally felt like it was taking notes from the Uncharted playbook, enriching the experience far beyond simple platforming by breathing life into the world. At the very beginning, after an introductory segment of spelunking which leads to the obligatory collapsing tomb, of course, Jonah suggests dinner at a local cafe.
Hey, you want to freshen up? Regroup at the cafe?
When handled right, this sort of narrative is such a treat because it breeds immersion as it gives context and helps build a larger picture of the location where the treasure hunting is being carried out. Lara travels the world and is supposedly a socialite, but we so rarely get to experience the delights of her globe-trotting adventures. Having said that, we also experience the other side of that very same coin when, after some extensive jungle exploring, Lara is accepted a little too easily into the hearts and homes of the hidden Peruvian people of Petiti, who then ask her to attend to silly tasks in order to advance side quests.
They demand half of all profits earned on market day. But if they think I tried to short them...
RPGs can be super fun, but this was turning out to be a very different experience from the horror survival that we saw in the first. It just seems like a much less grounded story than that of the first game, where interactions beyond those with your friends were kept to a minimum, and plot holes were harder to spot because the plot was less convoluted. Speaking of which, aside from a return of Trinity, we now face the mysterious cult of Kukulkan, as well as the creepy Yaxi guardian creatures who bring back some semblance of the lost horror element. Other additions include plants that can be used to provide buffs, as well as yet more combat and movement upgrades. The big blockbuster cinematics that have Lara duck, dodge and dive and evade everything from arrows to acts of God are of course ever present, and more memorable than ever, but thankfully this time around they're actually used more sparingly so as not to break up the immersion too much and have a grander effect when they do. Overall, where Rise attempted to scale up the best of the 2013 reboot and relied on new terrains to set itself apart, Shadow rebalanced the game and then breathed new life in the form of NPCs, harder puzzles and a richer storyline.
And you, Lara? How many lives have you ended?
But by putting more focus on these elements, it strayed dangerously into RPG territory, both through equipment upgrades and character interactions.
Let me guess, Omar sent you to shake me down?
And having further toned down the intense graphical scenes and general tone of the original, it once again served to amuse audiences but failed to wow critics. In May 2022, Square Enix sold a number of development studios and their accompanying intellectual properties to Sweden's mighty Embracer Group, with little public explanation beyond claiming that Tomb Raider had proven to be less lucrative than they'd hoped. As Tomb Raider is still safely in the hands of Crystal Dynamics, then it comes down to who will front the cash and how much they're going to lean on the developers to either strangle their innovation or take a risk and again give them the freedom to build something special. Tomb Raider Reloaded. In the meantime, we'll have to make do with Tomb Raider Reloaded. To even call it Tomb Raider hurts my soul, as it's the antithesis of everything wrong with mobile gaming. I wouldn't even bring it up except for the fact that it was actually released by Square Enix as they complete their sale of Crystal Dynamics to the Embracer Group and tried one last push to squeeze out some cash from the franchise with this soulless coin collection garbage riddled with microtransactions. It has more in common with Candy Crush than the beloved franchise. You can shoot or move, but not do both, and perish the thought of acrobatics, or any puzzles that are more complicated than turning off a light switch. And despite the charming addition of legacy characters who appear on screen, it's about as far from fan service as you can actually go, even if you tried. As far as gimmicks go, this is the top of the pile. The ginormous Nordic holding company that is Embracer Group wouldn't have purchased the IP if they didn't intend to monetize it. According to the Embracer Group website, the acquisition brings a compelling pipeline of new installments from the beloved franchises, including a new Tomb Raider game. We live in hope. Thank you so much for watching. If you can bring yourself to give the video a like or even subscribe, I would be so grateful. It really is the currency of YouTube, so I have to ask. Take care of yourself, and hopefully see you next time.